કેમેરાનો વ્યૂ. શ્યામ શ્યામ સર, આ થોડો કેમેરાનો વ્યૂ જોઈ લો ને. પછી દીવો દેખાવો જોઈએ ને.
હિતાંશુભાઈ યુટ્યુબ જોઈ લેજો.
બને ને આપણે તો હાથ પીન નાખીશું ને તો બાજુમાં દેખાશે ને. એક વાર આમાંથી ટેસ્ટ આપી છે ને.
બોલું કે
ના ના, ટેસ્ટ કરીને એટલે હું બોલું ને આમાં માઇકમાં ખબર તો પડે. સરસ. हेलो श्याम, माइक चेक करने.
हेलो 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 ओके
Sir, 98 to column 82.
Okay. Good morning. We'll start. Let's start. So good morning and welcome to this fourth annual economics conference organized by the Amrut Mody School of Management, Ahmedabad University. Here in Ahmedabad today, we started the conference yesterday with a small felicitation for Dr. Rangarajan on his 91st birthday. And we carry on today with the academic sessions. I don't want to take too much of time in this and before, but just a couple of things. First of all, welcome to Ahmedabad, welcome to Ahmedabad University, and welcome to AMSOM itself. The conference is directed, as you can see, as the economic setup, but it is more with to link up economics and finance. So we will have sessions on economics and finance. It's this time we kind of ran because of certain constraints coming out of COVID and all of it. The conference could not be held over the last couple of years in this format. I think last year it was done in an online format, but we decided to go back. But again, we had a short time window, which essentially meant that we could only run the call for papers for a limited time. But having said that, I'm extremely thankful to all of the people who submitted their papers. We had close to about 150 submissions, and we selected at the end of it, I think 62 or so papers, which will be presented over the next 2 days, over the next, I think 6 concurrent sessions spread over 2 days that we have. And we hope and we believe that the selection has been of one of the highest qualities, and all of you will enjoy listening to the papers, listening to the work that others and colleagues will share out here. We're also happy to announce that Economic Modeling has agreed to do a tie-up with the conference, under which selected papers from here would be dealt with by Economic Modeling not for a special issue, but a regular issue on a fast-track basis, which, and as all of you know, Economic Modeling is an A-rated journal of the ABDC ranking list. So we do have that possibility, but it's also always open to individual authors. While we will make an invitation and while we'll invite people to come and do that, you will have to agree to kind of doing that. It's not an automatic thing. So don't worry about that. It will automatically get, pulled into that publication process because people may have other expectations. The other highlight of the conference, I think, is the galaxy of plenary and invited speakers that we have. We have a very illustrious set of speakers that we have out here today with us, both over today and tomorrow. We obviously have Dr. Rangarajan himself, who's been the governor of Reserve Bank of India. I mean, he's held very many capacities, but he's been the governor of Reserve Bank of India. He's also been the chairman of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council for 2 different terms. And I think he's kind of really shaped economic policy in India in what we have grown up in the post-liberalized, post-1991 era. I mean, if there's one individual who's kind of been driving policy in India for over 30 years, both from within and outside the government, I think Dr. Rangarajan would be the foremost of them. We also have Professor Kaushik Basu, who's been, again, a chief economic advisor to the government of India and currently is the Karl Marx professor of economics at the Cornell University. He incidentally also was the chief economist at the World Bank. We're very thankful to Professor Ariel Rubinstein of NYU and Tel Aviv University to have come here. He's also going to be speaking at the conference, I think, tomorrow morning. Apart from that, we have Professor Alaka Basu, we have Professor Sanjay Banerjee and Professor Chirantan Chatterjee, who's, I think, on his way right now, who will also deliver special addresses at different points in time during the conference. So I think overall, we have a very interesting mix of talks, very informative, and I'm sure all of you as participants in the conference will really enjoy listening to all of them. Without further delay and further ado, I know there was the brief discussion, let's just quickly get started. And before I ask the Vice Chancellor, Professor Pankaj Chandra, to say a few words, can I just request the Vice Chancellor, the Registrar, and the guests to kind of please light the lamp and then I can invite Pankaj to. Sir? Mr. Shah? One minute. Thank you very much. Can I now ask Professor Pankaj Chandra, Vice Chancellor, Ahmedabad University, to say a few words, and then we can get started with the presentation.
Thank you very much, Sankarshan. Good morning and welcome to Ahmedabad University. It's my duty to tell you a little bit about this very young and exciting institution that we are building here on the banks of Sabarmati. Founded by a very unusual trust called Ahmedabad Education Society. It's very rare that there's a private trust that's involved in setting up public institutions. Ahmedabad Education Society has been one of them, responsible for the establishment of, since 1930s, of some of the best institutions out of the city, like IIM Ahmedabad, National Institute of Design, Physical Research Laboratory when Vikram Sarabhai wanted to set up a center for high altitude physics, CEPT, and Ahmedabad University is perhaps one of its most ambitious projects of putting a liberal education-driven multidisciplinary research university on the ground. So welcome. We're at very early stages of building of this institution. And our perspective on the world is a little bit different. And you will see that perhaps in this conference. We felt that this 21st century problems, which are so wicked, don't then lend themselves to disciplinary solutions. And it was very critical for us to think through and figure out how do you find to build interdisciplinary education framework, both at the undergraduate level and hopefully as time passes by at graduate education level as well. And happy to inform you that we've actually built a very unusual set of programs that cut across disciplines and built a research agenda that is very interdisciplinary in nature. So I welcome you to this journey, and hopefully even after the conference gets over, you will engage with us and be able to participate and support in what's happening here. I just want to also make one other statement before I conclude. Today's world requires looking at issues that where assumptions of the past have changed quite dramatically, and for a variety of reasons, technology being one of them. And I'm just wondering if this conference would want to think about how technology is manifesting in many of our lives and the way we do things very differently, and what might be economic, social, and political consequences of it. I know there's a lot of work happening around the world, but it would be great to see how we think through within the context of the country. Welcome, and I'm sure you will have a wonderful 2 days. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Chandra. Thank you very much for that, for those nice and encouraging words to start off the conference. I don't want to stand too much between the first plenary speaker and now, but just quickly, we also need to take this opportunity to thank our three primary sponsors, the Bank of Maharashtra, the Federal Bank, and ICICI Bank, who have helped us put together the conference of this scale, because obviously a conference of, and then also I should also mention the University Research Board, and the university itself, which has kind of made sure that all facilities and all support exists to ensure that the conference of this scale can be put up out here and in the manner that you can see. So thank you very much to all our sponsors. I also like to kind of just very quickly take half a minute to say that while I stand here to kind of talk about this, I think most of the work for the conference has been done by some of my colleagues, in particular, Professor Abhinandan Sinha, Professor Samarth Agarwal, and Professor Saumil Shah. I think, I mean, a lot of the things that you see, or in fact, all that you see today out here in terms of the conference is an outcome of their work and their dedication in terms of putting this show together and getting it off the ground. So thank you very much to all of you. Okay. Without further delay, can I request Professor Jimal Unni to kind of come up and start chairing the first session, which is the first plenary by Professor Kaushik Basu. But I'll let Professor Unni come up and...
Good morning, everyone, and good morning to all our respected plenary and participants who have come from all over India. We've had an exceptionally large number of papers at this conference, and we're sorry we had to cut down, and we are still running like 3 parallel sessions in order to accommodate as many papers as we possibly can. So in this session is a plenary where we'll have Professor Kaushik Basu address us. Kaushik Basu doesn't need any introduction. He's best known for being a professor of economics at Cornell University. And in India, we know him as the chief economic advisor, where he spent, I think, 5 to 7 years. And then after that, I'll say that he was the chief economist at the World Bank in that ranking order. So without any further, his CV is so long, his Wikipedia thing is so long, I think all of us can see it. Without further ado, I'll request Professor Kaushik Basu to come on stage. He will be speaking to us today on economic theory for a changing world, methodology and methods. And knowing Professor Kaushik Basu, I'm sure he'll make it simple enough for all of us from all disciplines to understand and appreciate. Thank you, Professor Basu.
You need collar mic or this mic? I think I might take a collar mic. No problem.
Take this off also. The pen, let me get that. So let me just see if this is working. Yes, that's fine. No, I've got it with me, so. Yeah, I think I'm all set. Thank you very much. I see Dr. Rangarajan over here, your Vice Chancellor, Professor Chandra, Dean Basu, many other friends and people in the audience. It's Jimal. Thank you very much. I've known Jimal for years. We've traveled in Gujarat, traveled in other places in connection with research being done with some people at Cornell and other places. It just feels wonderful to be back here. My friend also Ariel Rubinstein is here. It's a pleasure. Welcome to all of you. And it's a great honor to address this. I have to say right at the beginning that I really feel energized in this last barely a day and a half here, listening to yesterday's discussion in the evening and interacting. I feel the energy in this place. And it's just a wonderful feeling. I don't know, occasionally you feel over-optimistic about a nation, occasionally you feel over-pessimistic. I'm in an over-optimistic phase right now. Just seeing the energy of this place, and yesterday's meeting, I was thinking it's one of the finest discussions I was sitting in. Dr. Rangarajan, but all the speakers, it was an absolutely riveting session about professional policy making, the interface between the world of research and the world of policy. That came up yesterday was extremely heartening. So again, thank you for the university here for this effort, and do keep it up. I mean, the country depends a lot on that. Before getting into my topic, I should just tell you that I've been introduced several times in the last 2 days, including just now by Sankarshan Basu, for being the Karl Marx professor at Cornell. And I just want to clarify that in any of the Indian languages, the spelling difference will not show up. But in English, the Karl Marx professor that I am is not Karlmarx, but Carlmarks, Karl Marx, a person who actually, in fact, very interestingly, had a connection with the Russian Revolution. He invested a lot of his money in Russia up to 1917. And made a huge amount of money and gave Cornell this big grant to set up a research group and the chair. So that's the Karl Marx professor, which in India does not show, and I don't mind. It gets cloudy about which Karl Marx this is. Actually, I should add that to add to that complication, my mother, when she was 8, my mother passed away at the age of 91. From about the age of 89, she was still generally clear and in very good shape. But the 2 words that she was beginning to get confused over was economist and communist. So with the mother's pride, the way mothers typically do, she would phone up people and say that my son is a very well-known communist. It made it very awkward for me with a Karl Marx chair, which a well-known communist was a deadly combination to have. Let me plunge into the topic of today. I've chosen something very unusual. Obinandan must be here. Yes, I've had a lot of correspondence with Obinandan, just very, very helpful. I decided on something a bit unusual, taking advantage of the fact that this is not quite a seminar, but a public lecture. I want to first talk about the changing nature of the world a bit in broad terms, the economic world, the challenges it poses to economics, and I do think economic theory has a very special role to play over here. I want to talk broadly about that. And then to illustrate, I've got, on my PowerPoint, I've got lots of little models. I will probably give you flavors of 2 models of taking something very realistic and trying to bring a little bit of analysis to that. That's my plan for today. We are going through very, very troubled times. No doubt about that. You all know that. You have to just look around the world. The reason for that, let me keep my topics here that I plan to cover. The reason for the troubles right now, and you know, there's a virtual recession looming over the advanced economies. And as I've said in several different locations, that we must not sit back feeling comfortable. It is true that the Indian economy on the whole is doing well compared to the advanced economies. But once a major trouble begins to brew in the advanced economies, if it becomes a recession, it's going to come cascading all over the world. And we will have to have measures to take on that challenge. What is causing the challenge? If you ask most people, journalists observing the immediate economy, the stress is always on the two things that have happened over the last 2-3 years. The COVID-19 pandemic has ravaged our world. India was hit very, very badly. Our growth rate had plummeted down during that period, but all over the world, the COVID-19 pandemic messed things up. The Ukraine war, Putin's Ukraine war has also changed the scenario dramatically because supply chain disruptions taking place. Earlier sort of things you would not even think of. There's trouble in the port near Ukraine and food shortages in Africa. It's a highly linked world. So one thing can create a problem elsewhere. But beneath all this, there is a bigger change that was taking place. And I feel these were just sparks which lit the fire, but there was a change that was taking place. The change on the face of it is a good thing, technological advance. The rise of digital technology, and as your Vice Chancellor just pointed out, given that there is an interest here in working on that, I do want to stress, the rise of digital technology, like all technological advance, expands the cake. In the language of economists, the production possibility frontier of the world goes up, because you've got better technology. But a technology changes the nature of economic interaction. And as the nature of economic interaction begins to change, you have new challenges for policy making, just the functioning of the economy. And I feel what has happened is, with the digital advance that was taking place over the last 30, 40 years, we were getting ready for trouble, and then the spark was lit by COVID-19. And one example is, we know from studies Diane Coyle and others have done, that once you have new technology, it takes a very long time for the technology to seep into society, for people to actually use it. So you get a lot of time to adjust to new technology. What happened with the digital advance and COVID is one thing which we academics, even policymakers, can see: the use of Zooms, the use of WebEx. We've started now, it's very comfortably. I remember the first days when I would give lecture on Zoom, I would be fumbling, not knowing quite how to handle. And if there was no COVID-19 and I was given all the time to get used to Zoom lectures, I would have taken 10 years. But we did not have that luxury. Learning by doing, where you learn something by actually doing it, not by sitting in a classroom, is something that Kenneth Arrow had written about. As an academic matter, that it's important. But the COVID-19 was a period of learning by doing. The technology has jumped up, and today we can conduct lectures. I need not travel. I can have meetings. This afternoon, I will have a meeting anywhere in the world. So the use has gone up, and it's changing the landscape. A good example of the problem that can arise with technological advance is the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, in retrospect, we take it as good. If you don't look at the details of roughly 1750 to 1850, the Industrial Revolution has made the world more prosperous. We know from Angus Madison's studies that before the Industrial Revolution, the global growth rate used to be roughly 0.3% per annum. So each year, the country is better off by 0.3%. The world is better off. That's the GDP growth. After the Industrial Revolution, the global growth rate became 2.1% per annum. So can you imagine the jump in growth rate from 0.3 to 2.1? If that happens once again, we'll be at 14% per annum after this. With this kind of a change taking place, it looks all good, but it was not all good. The Industrial Revolution was actually a dreadful period. There was huge amounts of suffering. First of all, pollution would darken the skies. You would read it in fiction and novel, British writing, the darkened skies. There would be children working for 12, 14 hours, and child labor, the proportion used to be over 30% of the children would be working. So this you get only in some deepest poverty regions of sub-Saharan Africa. Child labor of the proportion of over 30%, they were working, no human capital being acquired. We came out of that because of two things. One, which is written about a lot, policy, out-of-the-box policy, new kinds of policy, which today looks completely commonplace, but that time were radical policies. You know, when the income tax is brought in 1842, In Britain, there's a huge amount of criticism. What is this shocking tax that is being placed by government? Today, we treat it as a part of life. It has to be there if a government has to run income tax. And in fact, I believe the income tax should be quite severe because a lot of the inequality in the world is completely uncalled for. The child who is being born poor is not choosing to be lazy and poor. It's forced upon them. We have to have a certain amount of redistribution for that. But that looked like a radical policy. Whole lot of child labor laws right from 1802, Robert Peel's Act, very radical. All that has been written about a lot. Another thing that we know but has not been written about and talked about enough, but I think is extremely important, is the revolution in economic thinking, economic theory. If you think of that period, the Industrial Revolution, roughly I'm taking 1750 to 1850, 1860. It's also the most dramatic period of our changing view of the economy. From Adam Smith in 1776, Augustine Cournot, 1838, there's David Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, and our changing the way we view the world and ending up with Leon Walras, 1874, roughly 100 years, is among the most dramatic period of change in the view of the world, our understanding of the world. And I think we have been saved. The Industrial Revolution has conferred benefit on us on both accounts. Out of the box policy thinking and out of the box analysis of the economy. And here I want to get into research and the kind of research that we need to do. I do believe that not for a moment do I want to discount the large amount of understanding that we are getting from small experiments, randomized controlled trials, data coming in, extremely important. But we also need once again to go back to the drafting table, look at the world, and a lot of it is not, I know actually Ariel Rubinstein has written about it, that more important than reading papers is to look at the world, stare at the world and try to understand are the parts fitting together. And that very often gives you novel ways of analyzing. And that's what I mean by theory. By theory, I'm not referring to little mathematical exercises. Again, I don't want to decry that. Often the mathematics is the foundation, but a lot of theory can be done with very little mathematics by looking at the world and suddenly an idea strikes you. George Akerlof's asymmetric information I'm thinking of, that one side of the market, the seller in some products has more information about the product than the buyer has, and that can ravage the properties of the standard Arrow-Debreu model once you have this asymmetry. And how did Akerlof get this idea? India played a very major role. He had spent a big chunk of time in Delhi as a young man, and observing markets, he was realizing that when you go, that the buyer and the seller very often are asymmetrically positioned. And then he realized it's a big discovery. And if you read his paper, one equation, it's conversation written down, but it's a very, very big idea being brought in. What is a big idea and a small idea? There are researchers here I want to stress a little bit. Standard research, you would, in maybe using Thomas Kuhn's language, I would talk in terms of like normal science, normal economics. What people do, and again, that's important, is look at the axioms that we write down explicitly. When you do a lot of economic analysis, you write diminishing returns to scale is important. No externalities. Preference must be transitive. If you prefer X to Y and if you prefer Y to Z, then X must be preferred to Z. These are all standard axioms, and you can do experiments and see are these axioms right or not. What we do not spend enough time on, and not that you'll make major discoveries there, is to look at assumptions which are into the woodwork of the discipline. Assumptions in the woodwork are assumptions that we make without even being aware that we are making an assumption. And economics profession, like any profession, I believe, is prone to that. The assumptions that I write down, A, B, C, D explicitly, are the simpler assumptions which I'm aware of. But I very often make assumptions about human beings that I'm not even writing down. It's a part and parcel of built into my head. When those assumptions get dislodged, your models will go awry. Your understanding of the economics will go awry, and we don't spend enough time on it. Kenneth Arrow, I mentioned, Arrow has a very beautiful paper where And Arrow, as you know, is the sort of founding father with Gerard Debreu of modern general equilibrium analysis, and a formalization, first time after about 200 years, of Adam Smith's idea of the invisible hand got formalized by the work of Arrow. Under what conditions will individual selfishness, individual striving lead to social optimality? We understood from that work. But Arrow, in a chatty paper in 1973, says that, without minimal norms, values, ethics, modern society, modern economy would not function. We don't write those down as axioms. We take them implicitly in our heads and we carry on with that. Trust among human beings. We don't write that down as an axiom, but that plays a role. If you look at trade and exchange across individuals, we know the assumptions needed for trade and exchange. But one assumption we never write down, whereas for any complicated trade, you do need that, is the ability to talk and communicate. We write down diminishing marginal returns to scale, transitivity of preference, no externality, but there is never an axiom which says can talk. Can talk is taken for granted. But when the nature of communication begins to change, that can talk and communicate can be jeopardized. And if the nature of communication is being jeopardized, ordinary market functioning can be jeopardized. One example from a different discipline of how implicit assumptions can be hardwired in our heads that we don't even realize, whereas the biggest breakthroughs come from that, is Euclid. I've had always a fascination, a kind of fascination with geometry, Euclidean geometry. Euclidean geometry is one of the first exercises in an axiomatic discipline. You write down all the explicit axioms. If x is equal to y, y is equal to z, then x must be equal to z. If the length of this line is the same as the length of this line and this line same as the third line, then the first line will have the same length as the third line. You write down all the axioms. He writes down the axioms and then he begins to prove theorems. One of the theorems, which was actually known before Euclid, is the Pythagoras theorem. But you can deduce it from Euclid's axioms. You can prove the Pythagoras theorem. So theorem, you're understanding the world. There was one assumption Euclid was making that Euclid was not aware of, because it seems so natural that you don't even write down that axiom, that his entire geometry was being done on a flat surface, not on a sphere like the earth. So if you took Euclidean geometry and derived results, and in the age of fast travel across the earth, use that geometry, you would make huge mistakes. There would be accidents taking place because you're getting your calculations wrong. That assumption that it's all being done on a flat surface is never written down as an axiom, but that was an axiom. And there again, the hope, as your Vice Chancellor said, as your Dean has been emphasizing, the interdisciplinarity is important. Some of the biggest breakthroughs come from people outside the discipline because they have the outsider's objectivity, which you get trained. As an economist, you get trained into an incapacity to think beyond the model in your head. And in geometry, that's the people who realized, the first people who realized that Euclid was using an assumption without being aware of that. The whole thing is being done on a flat surface, not on a surface like the one we live on. Omar Khayyam is one of the first persons. It struck him. He spent a little bit of time, didn't get anywhere. In the 1813, a German lawyer, Karl Ferdinand Schweikart, started feeling that there's a hidden assumption in geometry. And he begins to play around with it. He goes to Gauss and tells Gauss about this. Gauss had probably on his own thought about this, and a new geometry is developing, non-Euclidean geometry, with huge contributions subsequently, where you are learning to use the geometry on a sphere. That's a stark example from another discipline. In economics, I feel there are many, and I'll give you one or two in the concrete world. I was not planning to go into this, but let me do this since there was mention of technology. The digital platform which has come in, and like say Amazon, I'm buying and selling on that. Uber, I'm buying a ride on that, someone is selling a ride on that. Standard methods of analysis for the digital platform is causing a lot of problem. In the United States, there's a huge amount of writing about the inequality. I mean, people are concerned. What gives me a little bit of hope is that there are some super rich people in the United States who are pointing out that given the system, I'm glad I've made the money, but we do need a fairer system. We have to have a world where I will not be able to amass this kind of wealth as I've done. You need a fairer system by which we play. And if you look at the world, some of this is the digital platform. Over the last few years, inequality is rising everywhere. These digital technology is causing this, and our understanding is minimal. There's a lot of debate. A prominent writer is Lina Khan in United States, saying that we have to use our antitrust law much more aggressively. But you know, markets, incentives, profit, those are very, very important. You can't use antitrust law mechanically. You'll do more damage than good. Think of the platform. The advantage of the platform is the size. Hundreds and thousands of buyers and sellers are coming there. The advantage of information is enormous over there. It's all being pulled in. If you break up the platform and say, I want 1,000 platforms, you can join any to find your right, you've destroyed the advantage of a platform. When in the United States, the Sherman Act is being enacted in 1890, just before that, there is a recognition that we want to cut up into small businesses where there are no economies of scale. But if there is a huge economy of scale, you can't just cut it up into many pieces. So standard antitrust law, which served very well in the United States from 1890 to all the way to now, is beginning to flounder because the nature of the world is changing. And there's a relationship with economics. You know, in economics, there's modern economics. All of you, the students of economics, will be familiar. There are some black boxes. When you think of the market economy as functioning, we talk of the invisible hand. That goes back to Adam Smith, 1776. There are people who don't know anything else about Adam Smith, but they know that Adam Smith wrote about the invisible hand and how individuals pursuing their own benefits can confer benefit to society. I should just quickly put in a footnote. Adam Smith would shudder by today's world where people know nothing else about Adam Smith but the invisible hand, because when Adam Smith published his Wealth of Nations, in the first edition, invisible hands was not there in the index. So Adam Smith had no idea that that will be the most important thing that people would catch on to. It was not put in. It was only posthumously after he died, when an edition came out, invisible hand by then was picking up. Became the most important part, which was there. The invisible hand is not quite understood how it plays a role, but buyers and sellers are brought together through the invisible hand. Leon Walras, roughly 100 years after Adam Smith, is trying to explain market functioning, can explain the buyers and the sellers, how they are getting together. Cournot has done it, but who is it that is bringing the buyers and the sellers together, and exactly how, he does not know. So there is the invisible auctioneer left unmodeled. Think of the modern world, Uber, take Uber. Uber is suddenly the arrival of the invisible auctioneer becoming visible. And not just the invisible auctioneer has emerged in front of us, he's bringing the buyers and the sellers together. It's a profit-making entity. It's a corporation. So if you today want to model economy functioning, the old-fashioned model that we are all familiar with, students of economics, there are N sellers, N producers, and lots of buyers. This goes back to the work of Cournot and later Bertrand and others. The buyers and sellers market with N, and you write down the competitive process. You do equilibrium analysis. But now there are the N sellers, but there's one more agent. The auctioneer is now an agent, a profit-making agent, the platform. So you have to typically do a model of the market as N sellers plus one player who is the huge auctioneer, who's now a profit-making agent, the platform, Amazon or Uber, any of these is the player. You have to remodel that and try to understand this world. Lots of examples like that, and I do not for a moment want to pretend that the little theoretical ideas I do want to give you a bit of an exposure to right now can be done easily. I will pick very, very simple problems where I have little insights I'll give, but I feel you need bigger minds, deeper minds, and minds that will work over a long period, like the Industrial Revolution was 100 years of very deep research, which gave us an understanding of the world. There's scope for that, and there is need for that. So I'm going to pick on, I'm just thinking, I've got more than, yeah, let me just give you a little bit of the current situation. I'm organizing myself a bit, getting myself some water as well. I've got 2-3 different modeling exercises. The modelings which I want to do is to show you some very practical real world problem, and then how you can bring some insight into what's happening and understanding which may have failed you. But let me pick and choose as to which ones I will do, given that I will otherwise run short of time. Here is a picture of the changing scenario, which has been written about, the global scenario, just in the background, which I've already referred to. If you take the GDP and the fraction of GDP that is going to workers, the wage share in all advanced economies and all upper middle income economies, it's a dramatic decline taking place over the last 40-50 years. So from the GDP, a smaller and smaller segment is going as wages to workers. This is causing a big problem. In fact, in the United States, a lot of the political polarization that is taking place because of this. And one of the things that you have to understand is that one difference between the current technological revolution with the technological revolution of the Industrial Revolution time is we've got one new technology which allows workers to sit in faraway places and work for a customer 3,000 miles away. You sit in front of a computer and you're working for that person. India has done very well by this. Our takeoff from the 1990s when Infosys, Tata's, Wipro's early 1990s begin to link up India with the world, and India's takeoff is largely triggered by this change that is taking place in technology. So that is changing and causing polarization in societies. Now, the first reaction many people have is globalization is causing this. Work is getting shipped elsewhere. You need to stall globalization. Even Macron has talked about deglobalization. Maybe there is a need for that. There, I have to tell you my view that there are certain things in life which you have to take as given. Globalization is not being done by any single individual, whether it's Biden or Putin or Trump. No one is individually saying, let us globalize or let us not globalize. It's the drift in technology, newer discoveries, tiny bits happening in laboratories and different places, ideas is linking up the world. I don't think we have the capacity to stop globalization. Globalization is best thought of in like gravity. You may not like gravity, but don't waste time thinking in terms of how to stop gravity. Think of how you can cope with it and adjust your life, given that gravity is a part of life. Globalization to me is like that. And one reason also that countries, I don't think, will pull up their walls and cut off from the world is the following reason. Globalization gives you an advantage in the product market. When United States sells its products or services in the world, part of the reason why it's so efficient is it's using cheap labor available somewhere in the world. The labor linking technology is like discovering a resource in a faraway land. Once that has been discovered, it's to your advantage to use that. If you don't use that resource and just try to close your own boundaries, you'll be so inefficient in producing the final product that you'll get outcompeted by other countries that are using the cheap labor that is available. So I don't think that deglobalization is going to happen. Globalization is going to continue with leaps and bounds. That will create challenges. And I wanted to give you one example of, based on data. Let me see where I have placed this. This is pure numbers, which gives you a very, very interesting insight into a problem that the world faced. What I've got over here, later on, I mean, this is in a chatty paper I had written earlier. Subsequently, with Joe Stiglitz, we published a paper in Economic Journal about some of the regulatory features of the European Union and the Eurozone. Let me explain this to you. This is quite a fascinating picture. This shows you borrowing costs, interest rates of different Eurozone countries. up to 1999, you get this spread of interest rates. If Greece wants to borrow money, Greece has to pay you 20% interest rate. People would not give money to Greece if it's less than that. Germany can borrow money from you 4% interest rate. So the interest rates across these Eurozone countries are extremely diverse. And the reason you can see, if you're lending to Germany, you feel confident that you'll get the money back. If you're lending to Greece, you're a bit worried. Will you get the money back? And you say, well, I'll lend to you, but you have to give me a very high interest rate to compensate for that. So the market is causing the interest rates to be extremely diverse. 1999, the euro is constructed. When you're lending money, whether you're lending money to Greece, whether you're lending money to Germany, France, Italy, Portugal, Ireland, it's all euros. The money is being kept in euros. And then when you want to take out your money, you will get it in euros, you'll convert it and go. It's all looking the same. And what happened, and this turned out to be one of the biggest curses on the market, which prepared the world for a major crisis, is even sophisticated players started treating that whether you give money to Greece or whether you give money to Germany, it's all euro. It's a European Central Bank in the end, no more independent banks. It's the same, and the interest rates converge. Rarely do you in reality see this kind of a clean convergence. It's all converged. They are all borrowing at the same interest rate, roughly, because the market is treating them as equal. A realization dawns, and there are market failures happen because it's a new world. This construction of the euro is something which is dramatic. Big countries coming together and common currency, a mistake is possible. What is the mistake? The mistake is there is a clause in the Treaty of Maastricht and later on ratified in the Treaty of Lisbon, which takes over, a clause which says that one country borrowing money, it's the responsibility of that country to pay back. The ECB will not get into this. So if Greece has borrowed money from you, when the time comes to collect the money, you can't go to ECB and say it's euro and it's your collectivity. It's Greece. 2008, with the subprime crisis in the United States, there's a gradual realization that are we making a mistake when we are treating them all on par? And indeed, it's a huge mistake because it's a big mistake for another reason. Before the Eurozone is constructed, if you lend money to Greece and Greece has to pay you back, you know that in the absolute desperate situation, Greece will probably print money and pay you back. Now there's an additional problem. Greece doesn't even have the power to print. That's with ECB. So you've lent money to Greece, Greece has to pay you back, Greece no longer has the capacity to print money. It's a new world. And when that realization came, suddenly the interest rates again spanned out all over the place. Greece is borrowing at 20%, Germany at 4%, it's spread out. But a big damage has been done over this period because of our misunderstanding of the economy. There's been over borrowing by countries that have taken place. And the debt to GDP ratio of many European countries have built up because they were getting interest money so cheap that Portugal, Greece, Ireland, they were taking in huge amounts of money during this period when the interest rates are flat and low everywhere. And then comes the sovereign debt crisis from roughly 2010, 2011. After the Great Recession is easing up, the European countries are in a mess because they're all massively over indebted. If we had a better understanding of this, actually, this would have been a palpable difference to the world. We would have negotiated it much better than what happened at that period. You know, India is an interesting example. For a long time, India's debt to GDP ratio would be considered high compared to advanced economies. But that changed because the advanced economies had borrowed so much. The debt to GDP ratio, India's is high, but not that high. By the way, since Dr. Rangarajan is here, I should point out, we often derive comfort from that, but you have to remember that the interest payment that India has to do as a fraction of the revenue receipts is very high in India. So that burden is disproportionately high if you compare it with Japan, if you compare it with United States. India's centers is something like over 40% now of the revenue receipts is just repayment, which is preventing productive investment. These are the details where if you are into detailed policy making, studying carefully, you will spot If you're treating everything as intuition and common sense, you will miss out with big consequences for the country. Okay, this is one example I wanted to give, and now I'm making a choice as to what I will inflict on you next. I've got theoretical idea-wise 2-3 different things. I feel like giving you, yes, time-wise I'm doing fine, right? I'm going to inflict a little bit of game theory on you. This is actually my current interest. I'm doing a lot of work. Obinandan and I have been chatting a little bit about this with people in the United States primarily who have got interested in this. I have a very special, it's special in my heart, this particular research, because very casually my friends in the philosophy department in Cornell once said that, why don't you come and just talk to us, brown bag lunch. We do very different kind of work from what you do, but come and talk to us about what you do. In fact, one of the persons inviting was a prominent Indian philosopher at Cornell, Rachna Kamtekar, who's a great authority on Greek philosophy. They invited me for a brown bag lunch. And I talked about something which I think is, again, an everyday problem that we all face. It's a politically a very, very sensitive topic. Group morality. When a group behaves badly, how do you apportion the moral responsibility across individuals in the group? Who is responsible? And there are philosophy writings, beautiful pieces like one is by Joel Feinberg in Journal of Philosophy, which sort of sums up and is cited a lot in this literature. There's a whole lot of people lying on a sea beach and sunbathing when one person begins to drown. That person begins to drown and actually drowns. No one gets up to save this person. Who is morally responsible? This group has behaved very, very badly. No one gets up to save this person. There subtle things come up. If the structure of the problem is such, and you just think about it, there's no economics or analysis involved, 100 people sunbathing, 1 person drowning. If the problem is such, any person getting up could have saved this person, then I think we will all agree, I would feel all 100 of them are responsible. Any one of you could have got up and done it. No one did it. If the problem is a bit more structurally different, it's a bigger problem. Suppose if all 100 people get up and try to help, you can save, otherwise you can't save. And no one got up. Are you responsible for this or not? So there are these kinds of questions arising, moral questions. While playing around with this, I hope I'll give you a very clean example. I wanted to alert human beings that when we hold a group responsible for bad behavior, we have to be careful. You can get paradoxical results, which game theory is full of paradoxical results. This is not a deep logical paradox, but conflicts with our intuition. And we have to be open to that to create a fairer world. And this is a tiny little example which I created and published. I wanted to give you a flavor. This is a 2-player game. Even if you don't do game theory, let me explain, you should have no problem. One person chooses between the rows A, B, and C. You have to choose between A, B, and C. Jimal has to choose between A, B, and C. And Pankaj has to choose between the columns A, B, and C. After they have both chosen, how many dollars? The original story is in dollars. Don't make me convert into rupees. Let me stay with the way it was published. This is the dollar payment that you will get. The left-hand figure is the person who's choosing rows will get. So if both of them choose B, they will get $104 each. If one person chooses B and one person chooses C, the person choosing B gets $80, person choosing C gets $102. That's the game. Where will this game settle down? How will they play? And I'm over here using what is in economics a standard notion, John Nash's famous equilibrium. What is a Nash equilibrium here? You don't even need to know a word about Nash. The equilibrium here is a completely intuitive idea. And equilibrium is a choice of strategy, one by Jimal, one by Pankaj, such that given this choice, neither can do better by deviating. If you get a pair like that, that's an equilibrium. There's nothing I can do. There's only one such pair. I've cooked up the problem. If both of them choose B, nothing anyone can do to individually do better. Any other pair, For instance, if both of them were choosing A, they are getting $102 each. That's not an equilibrium because Jimol will immediately think, if I switch to B alone, from 102, I'll get 120. There's only one parking place, BB. Both will settle down at BB. That's the Nash equilibrium. In this case, the Nash equilibrium, which can be controversial in complex games, I've created a game where that's the only reasonable place. That's the equilibrium. Now, if they are selfish, they will both choose B and get B. Now, the question I'm raising is the question that Greta Thunberg raises, that look, we must not be endlessly selfish. Many of our actions have an effect on a bystander, the future generation, our children's children who will come into the earth and will inherit. They can't do anything to affect us, but their welfare will depend on what we are doing. So the bystanders get some payoff, and I'm going to show you if these two people play the game like this, how much will the bystander, the next generation, get? I've created an example. This is the bystander's payoff. If she chooses A, he chooses A, the bystander will get $20. If she chooses B and he chooses B, as they will do in this game we just saw, the bystander will get $6, etc. As you can see, these people are very well off. And around $100 is what they're getting. The bystander, whether they are the poor people living in the fringes of society or the future generation, more or less powerless, they get the fallout of what these people do. This is the payoff of these people. Now, Greta Thunberg comes and gives a lecture, or the Good Samaritan comes and gives a lecture. That, look, don't be selfish. Okay, don't think about the other person's welfare because we are both quite well off, hundreds of dollars. Think of the future bystander. If this lesson goes down well, that you have to think of the bystander, what you will tend to do is, when you make your choice, you will want to do well for yourself, but also take into consideration the bystander's income. So what I'm going to do now is go back to the original game and create a new game where they have become moral creatures. They are concerned about the bystander. So along with your own payoff, like when you're playing A, both of you, you're getting 102. But after you become moral, you take into account the bystander's payoff, which is 20. So the game now becomes 100 and 200. Sorry, I should have gone here. 122, 122, if you both choose AA, because you've taken into account the other person's payoff. Once you become moral, take a look and see where your moral creatures now playing this game. Where will the outcome go to? If you're both moral, you're choosing ABC and the other person choosing ABC, there's only one equilibrium. You will both settle at CC. If you both choose C, you're getting a value, which is a combination of your own dollars, and you're now a moral creature, you're giving value to the poor persons. 110, 110, and you can't do any better. If you go to A, you'll get 108. If you go to B, you'll get 90, 110, 110, you're stuck. Once you become a moral creature, so earlier, you were choosing BB and the bystander was getting 6. Because the bystander is just, whatever you do, you get the fallout. After you become a moral creature, the equilibrium becomes here and you can see what's happening. The bystander is getting 4. Because if both of you choose C, the bystander gets 4. So after both of you become moral, the bystander, moral means you're giving a special weight to the bystander. The strategic environment changes in a way, the bystander gets hit even worse. An outside observer looking at this society will say, this is horrible. The other society at least was allowing $6 for the bystander. Now people are giving $4 to the bystander. But that's happening because you've become moral creatures. And that's a warning, which to me is the important kind of practical lesson from game theory, is that in strategic environments, intention, individual intention and group behavior outcome can be very, very diverse. This is a dangerous result because you can misuse this, but it's even more dangerous not to be aware that this can happen. Then you just give a black and white picture on groups. As soon as you see a behavior, you put a label. I do believe that there is a biggish agenda over here to think about. And in my last 2 years that I've got into this research area, I have been having interactions with people in America, there are a whole lot of people who are doing work on this. Some of them are game philosophers with a little bit of interest in game theory. And I feel it's got a biggish agenda over here, which is important for us to understand. I was thinking I'll take 5 more minutes and give you one more example of modeling exercise. I was just choosing these. Which one will I do is what I'm just thinking. Don't worry, I'm not going to inflict any equation, but let me in words tell you this, and I will actually, I'll just use this single picture and tell you the story, and I'll stop with that. Here's one more exercise, which I've got into now. Again, looking at something very practical, barring the little elementary use of old-fashioned oligopoly analysis, which all of us do as undergraduates. There's no further special economics you need, but it's a theoretical exercise. You know, one thing that is being written about a lot is supply chain effect. And the world is going through supply chain problems, which are mega. And one of my fears is that some of the biggest problems in the world over the next 2-3 years is going to be the source of it is going to be the supply chains. Supply chain disruptions, which can happen because of natural reasons. The chips are not coming from Taiwan. It causes problems all through the world. But there's another side to it. Countries are gradually realizing that disrupting a supply chain is a weapon of war, is an instrument of war, and actually more powerful than many airplanes and bombs. Through a supply chain disruption, you can hold the whole world at stake. And in the United States, there's talk of friend shoring and other things, but I don't think that's the way to get at it. The supply chain needs to be, we need to understand what the supply chain is doing, and then again, think of very novel policies to get around it. But this is a big problem we are facing. I was playing around and created a very extreme model just to get an understanding in my head. You know, typically, when we do oligopoly analysis, here's a demand curve, price, quantity, standard demand curve, downward sloping demand curve, marginal cost at K, and you get the monopoly equilibrium is pinpointed over there. And as you get duopoly, triopoly, many firms, the equilibrium keeps shifting, price comes down, and equilibrium is moving towards the competitive equilibrium. But construct a multi-firm industry in a different way. In the old-fashioned world of Kurno, 1838, or Batra, there are 100 firms producing cars. They produce cars and they compete. I will now make you create another world which is inching towards the world we are moving into. There are 100 firms producing cars, but it is not one firm producing cars, firm number 2 producing cars, firm number 3 producing cars. No. One firm producing all the wheels. They've become very good at wheels, sitting in China and producing wheels. One firm producing all the chassis of the car. One firm producing all the brakes of the car. I don't know enough about the parts of the car to continue describing this, but there are different parts, each one being produced by one country or one firm, which is becoming very good at this. So there are 100 firms producing cars, but I have used the term vertically serrated industry. Each firm is producing one component of the car, and then one firm puts these together. I know reality is not as extreme as this, but we are switching from one to the other with economies of scale. And this is the supply chain, one country sitting and producing all parts of one part of the car, another country producing one, and you're putting them together to produce a car. What will the equilibrium look like? Very, very different from the equilibrium you think of. If you do it in a mechanical exercise, and we do know from the history of these things that you can keep changing the model and get different results, it moves the other way around. As more and more it's getting vertically serrated, different components being made by different firms, your economies of scale may be increasing, but the price is going to rise. The consumer is going to suffer. The equilibrium moves in the opposite direction. As the number of firms increase in a conventional oligopoly, equilibrium moves towards the competitive equilibrium. In a vertically fragmented or vertically serrated, as I called it elsewhere, equilibrium, you begin to move in the opposite direction. And inequality goes up because the prices are rising, ordinary people are suffering. What do you do about this? Let me just spend 2-3 minutes on the policy questions. I wanted to talk about economic theory. you have to think outside of the box in terms of a policy. One of the things I've thought of is something like Amazon or Uber. You can't just cut it up and make it into many firms. The profit incentive is important. I want much greater equality on earth, but I want to be realistic. I don't want to make foolish mistakes in the design. One possibility, and I say this very tentatively because we'll have to think of this, is you may want to have this dispersal of ownership of these companies. So if Uber makes mega profits, it would not matter if the profit, the shareholding of Uber is widely dispersed. It's still making profit, but it's going into many, many pockets. So we may have to think in terms of dispersal of profit. And another thing, which is even more radical thought, but you have to be open to this, that if you ever get a firm which is an entry point to the whole economy, you have to join this firm to survive. It may have to be taken away from the profit-making sector to make it into a non-profit firm. Sounds radical, but if you look back, we've done similar things. Bank of England is being formed in 1694. There are 1,200 shareholders. They earn profit from the money-creating power of Bank of England. Gradually, it is being realized that for anyone to survive in the modern economy, you have to first you have to get money. If that is being done through profit maximization, then the entry into the modern world, the gate is being managed by a profit maximizing agent. You can't do that. Even Reserve Bank of India, I don't know if you know, it began as a profit, as a private agency. At some point, it was realized that can't be left. You don't want the government also to treat it like a nationalized entity. You need an autonomous body, but not someone where people are trying to line their pockets through this. So it's some of the biggest platforms, which is an entry into the modern economy, you may have to look at the history of central banks and think of modern radical policies. So the agenda is wide open. The world, thanks to the rise of technology, we can be in a much better world than where we were 100 years ago. But this is a time for economists, social scientists, engineers to bring their minds for a lot of innovative thinking, for policymakers also to work together. It's a time for a lot of professional input, the kind of input that saved the world during the Industrial Revolution, to do that now. Thank you very much. Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Professor Basu, for that extremely enlightening and, as always, provocative talk that you have given us. I'm sure each of us have learned something different from what you said. We are up for questions. We don't have too much of time. We have 15 minutes, and it's going to be my pick. So get ready with your questions and put up your hand, and I'll call you. But before that, I just wanted to say that Professor Basu was talking about something that's fascinating all of us, the digital platforms. And he's making a plea for the very large platforms, which is deriving the advantage of economies of scale, spoken like a true economist. But it is also creating inequality. Now, there are a lot of small businesses and small platforms, Professor Basu, location-based local platforms, and also small businesses which are selling through social media. Is there not an advantage of having these small entrepreneurs that is not economies of scale, which might also be sharing wealth, as your last question was? You don't have to answer. We'll look at the, anyone question for Professor Basu? Yes, please.
Thank you, Kaushik. As usually, it's kind of a, wonderful presentation. For the vertically fragmented equilibrium that he is talking about, it is the many suppliers, right? So now, if I didn't read the paper, but it looks like the equilibrium is in alpha, which means the intercept, right? So the quantity is equal to 0 here, right? So what does it mean? Does it mean that, like, what's the interpretation of that?
Carry on, sorry.
So you say that is a vertically fragmented equilibrium, okay? So the monopoly equilibrium, competitive equilibrium, we know, but the vertically fragmented equilibrium, which means probably the number of supply components are probably infinitely too many, right? So if it is in alpha, then it means quantity is equal to 0, right?
Yeah.
So what's the interpretation of that? Like
I've got your question, so I'll explain. Yeah, I followed. Yeah.
Next. Lord?
Should I take these two questions? This
Sure,
is,
sure,
needs a little bit of detailed response. Let me first of all touch on what Jimal, you yourself raised. That's why I'm repeatedly reminding that a lot of this is pure advantage. These small platforms, even the big platforms, it's transforming life. I mean, like compared to the olden days when you're trying to connect, it's so much easier. Buying and selling is so much easier, huge benefits. So the intervention must not be a foolish kind which is going to bring this to a halt. We do want this technology to develop. And in general, I also believe that the profit motive is an important motive and you don't want to damage that. But there are some domains where you can't leave that money if it's being created by one authority. You can't have that a private sector that is doing it for profit. So we have to design this very, very carefully. Where do you take away that and where do you leave this? So that is the agenda that I'm pointing to. And again, the policy I generally don't go into very much, only because this is very early stage and I don't want to make policy mistakes. The biggest policy mistakes to me are the Russian experiment after 1917. The early ambitions are all very noble, that you want people to live according to their needs and do work according to ability. But then you design bad policies. In the end, it's the worst form of crony capitalism that Russia ended up with, starting from an idealism. So you have to be very careful when you move on the policy front. Sanjay, your question now. I should tell you, the way I model this, I didn't go into this, is in an oligopoly, standard, not Batra, Kurno. One person chooses the quantity, another person chooses the quantity, we all choose quantities, the price gets determined by the market. Now what I'm doing is, to do a vertically serrated industry, I choose the price of tires, the price that I'll charge for tires. Someone, the price for the brakes. So when you add all these up, you get the price of the car. And that determines how many cars you'll be able to sell. And now the competition is taking place. The game is each one is choosing the P. What happens is, take duopoly. If there are only two firms in the standard Kurno, from monopoly, you will move towards lower price, larger sales. Whereas if you have two producers of cars, one producing the bottom half of the car, another producing the front half, the equilibrium is going to go there. A higher price, fewer sales. You're not going to reach that point where the production goes to zero. But as it's increasing, you're going towards that. To that also, there is a counter. If price discrimination is possible, like we know, even in the standard oligopoly, we've discussed this 20 years ago, you'll end up at the Kurno equilibrium with all the surplus being extracted. Same thing will happen over there. In any case, inequality is going to go shockingly high. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, Vika. Get the.
Thank you, Professor Basu, for a very engaging and fascinating talk. My question relates to the graph which you showed about the falling labor share in the GDP. If you could please go back to that.
Sure. Oh, sorry.
No,
Oh,
next.
no, before that. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So we see about 5 countries here: Australia, European Union, Canada, and Japan and United States.
Yeah.
And if we look at the graph, it appears as if in Japan, the wage share in
Yeah.
GDP fell to the largest extent. In different countries, it has been different. In US, it is like quite less variation. Could you please explain why?
Yeah. It's very easy to give a short answer, which is no. I don't know the details. So I do know this difference. Why did Japan lose so much? Why the United States less? I don't know enough of the sort of detailed position. So all I know is that even into this, If you throw in the upper middle income countries, all will look roughly like that, but there are differences. What is common, and that's what I was emphasizing, so I don't really know the differences in policy or some structural thing which caused this, is one possibility is, of course, is that Japan begins very high, you will notice. So there may have been protective elements in Japan which gave them a very big disadvantage, which is going away very rapidly. They are all sort of converging from a bigger break, but I don't know the differences. What is important is, and I've done this with many other countries. If you take the upper middle income countries and advanced economies, all of them, it's going in the same direction. So that is a matter of concern. Yeah.
So if I may, it is also possible that as the less developed economies or lower middle income economies become more developed and achieve higher income levels, they will also experience this thing, and they will also converge along with these other countries at a similar level. And that is where, like, the share of the labor is in the GDP. That's where it will rest.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you're raising this, because I feel for a country like India, right now there is scope. This is not such a big worry. And I feel it's not for a long time. It's 10 years or so. Our labor is still much cheaper. So even as technology is advancing, if we can be a good global player, we can't close our doors, then this segment does not have to suffer. But as we become richer, we'll face exactly the same problem. And then it becomes a global problem, and no single country, by the way, you have to be realistic. You can't solve many of these problems individually. If you do something very rash, another country will outcompete you. So I feel we are also entering a phase of the global policy making where a lot of policy has to be done together. The G20 is one such body, but a whole lot of bodies. I've just written an op-ed about the responsibilities of G20, where you have to construct many of these laws collectively across countries so that no country can play another country off on this.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Pallavi?
Thank you very much for a very enlightening talk, Professor Basu. I had a couple of questions. The first is about the bystander game. So we understand that you can get this perverse outcome when you try to take into account the bystanders' preferences. But my question is, if you have any intuition as to why this happens, and in the space of bystander games, how likely is it that we get a perverse outcome like this? I mean, is it just a possibility, or it's something more than that? And for the vertically fragmented model, so as you mentioned, one of the motivations for vertical fragmentation is that you can get lower costs, lower marginal costs because of economies of scale. So there is some positive aspect to it as well. And I'm wondering why we are not able to see that in the model. I haven't read the paper, so I really don't know how that is showing up or where that shows up. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, one last question. Can we take, can you pass that on to Pallavi? Can you? Yeah.
Sorry, I've lost my voice. But in terms of inequality, when we were thinking about dispersal of profit a priori, someone coming in and thinking that their profits are going to be dispersed to a larger population. Obviously, it creates some perverse incentives. You may not want to start out in the first place. And then even in terms of like it being a non-profit, like I can understand the regulation of banks, like Bank of England, RBI, but a firm that is actually giving good at the end, right? I mean, many people have made better off. It seems like whether we want to solve inequality with dispersal of profit or opportunity. So that's kind of where I'm.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah, I'll take both these. So first of all, for the question at the back, how likely the bystanders, this kind of a paradoxical result? In reality, I don't know. For me, the bit of a shock was something which shouldn't have been a shock, and it's a bit of a shock, is to realize that just by what someone like Greta Thunberg with all her good intention is pushing us towards. If each of us become good intentioned in that manner, with the existing structure, you can do harm on that group. That to me was a surprise enough that I felt it's worth drawing attention to. How often will this happen? I don't know. But it's a bit like, I'll give you an example that everybody's familiar with, the prisoner's dilemma, which goes back to the 1950s. The story goes back to a little bit later when Tucker constructed it. The prisoner's dilemma is just a story. But it gradually became very, very important because we realized that, yes, we don't know what the payoffs will be, but it's a possibility. And that is really the spirit in which I present this, as it's a possibility we should be aware of, that just the good intention is not good enough. The design, the scientific part of it is good enough. And the example I give is again in Greta Thunberg's case, that her intention is very good and we should all have that intention, but we must not think that that intention is sufficient, because in a complicated world, it can backfire. And that's what I'm trying to illustrate. The vertical fragmentation, the positive aspect I skipped over. So there is no reason why it's nothing that you missed. You know, the marginal cost of producing the car that I had a horizontal line. There's an assumption here that as it's getting vertically fragmented, one person producing the front half of the car, another person producing the bottom half of the car, the marginal cost of producing the car is going down because they are becoming so good at the first half and so good at the second half that the overall cost is going down. So it's becoming an efficient industry because the cost of production is going down, but the consumer is being hit very badly. If it is a conventional oligopoly, it's going to go in the opposite direction. The producers are making huge gains and this segment is making a big loss. So that was it. To the question, Pallavi, your voice was no handicap. It was very clear question. So I see, through the creation of opportunities, that's the ideal. That you create opportunities and people take advantage of those opportunities and become better off. But it is possible. Create an extreme example that robots take over everything, in the sense they can do every kind of work, barring maybe research and a few other very, very composition of music, barring art, few things, everything is being done by robots. There's no more opportunity to go people and tell that, why don't you produce something? How? There's someone much more efficient doing. What do you do in that world? There you have to face the question that I'm confronting, that actually that's not a bad world. Some people, when you think of that as a disastrous world where all labor is gone. That's because we think that the only way to earn income is through your labor. But think of the wealthier classes. Think of the feudal lords in Europe. They used to work very little, but earned quite a bit through ownership. So then income is going to come from the ownership of the robots. There you do need redistribution. There's nothing else you can do when work has vanished. Ideally, yes, create opportunities for them to do, but you do that. And on profit dispersal, I should just clarify, I do believe that a certain amount of profit sharing across people is worth it. So a part of the profit should be collectively owned, the shares. You're earning from your shares, I'm earning, but this is part of it is dispersed. What I'm talking about in this context is actually not that. It's within a corporation, there should be a rule about dispersed profit sharing. So the shareholding has to be widely dispersed and not in a few hands. And here again, you have to design this very carefully. For initial innovative activity, you may need the incentive. I want to own half the firm and make mega profits. Otherwise, the risk is not worth it. So like in intellectual patents, you may need laws that in the beginning, it can be 3 people owning the entire firm till it becomes big. At some point, after 14 years, after 20 years, like in patent rules, there will be rules that the shareholding has to be dispersed and it's widely held. It's still profit-making, but it's widely held. Again, as I clarified, these are very early thoughts about a changing world and a direction in which we have to open our minds and do some thinking about.
Thank you, Professor Basu. We would love to go on, but I think now we have to move on. And thank you very much for this very fascinating lecture and the questions as well. Thank you. So we move on to the next building, I think, where the parallel sessions begin.